Thinking back to my childhood, the first memory that I have being in a refugee camp is probably when I went to the refugee camp school. It probably was my first day there. My uncle, who is actually 2 years older than I am, we were going to school. He and I both arrived late to class, and the Thai teacher who was teaching that class was very upset with us. So she took both of us to the front of the classroom, had us hold our hands up like in this position, and she took the ruler and hit the tips of her fingers. And it was very excruciating. I cried. I ran back to my parents and never came back to the school again or came back to her class again. My uncle, however, stayed because he was 2 years older than I was. I believe at that time I was probably just maybe 3.5 years old. That was very interesting for me because I've never been to school before. And being in the refugee camps, that was one of the opportunities that was provided for us, was to learn the Thai language as well as the Thai characters. And so that was what my parents wanted me to do. So I went to school and didn't like it and never went back. I don't believe my parents ever explained the situation that we were in. We were just told that we needed to be here because we had no home. We needed to move to this area to stay there. My parents never stated anything of the fact that we were to live there because we were being persecuted by the Viet Cong, nor were they telling us why we were there. I believe I found out why we were there when my dad was constantly going to an arena or a stage area where they were like gathering all these Hmong, I guess, refugee camp members, and they were calling out names. And I didn't really know what that was until I actually came to the United States and studied my own history in college. So at that time, I realized that memory was a memory of my dad waiting to get sponsors for coming to the United States. And I remember that there were lots of people. We couldn't even see the stage where the Thai official was calling the names, because you put your name on a list and you wait to get a sponsor from the United States. So my dad would every day go to this arena and wait, and there were just tons and tons of people, and I couldn't see. And I remember my dad picking me up and putting me on his shoulders so that I could see above everybody else. So it seems like we went there every single day, and we couldn't, or he just felt like there was no one out there that was willing to take him in. And so we went to that arena or the stage area day after day and waited for his name to be called. And that was the only way that you were able to leave the refugee camps and go to Bangkok and then get your papers to come to the United States. I believe one day he was just so tired of waiting that my mom's brother, who lives in France, decided that he wanted to sponsor us to the United States. And that's where I found the papers that had his name on it and had my dad's picture, my mom's picture, and my picture, and my brother's picture on it, because he was willing to sponsor us to France. And he was willing to put us down as someone he's going to take care of. So my dad was willing to do that. And then the next day we went back to the arena and the stage area where my dad's name was called. And I was surprised to find out that his name was called, because I was like, okay, I'm getting ready to go to France now, and now my dad's name is being called to go to the United States. And so that day pretty much was, I believe, I remember really, not as clearly as I should, but vividly, that my dad ran back home, or ran back to our little camp and told the whole entire family, and they just started packing their things because they don't give you a lot of time to pack your things. So they just started packing their things, and we just got on the bus. And I think that's as much as I can remember from that point. When we came to the U.S., I was about 5 years old. So I suspect that we were probably there about two years living in the refugee camps, because my second oldest brother, was born there. And then I was 5 when we came. And my parents left when I was probably just 2 years old. They have shared little bits and pieces about their journey out of Laos, but not as detailed as I would like them to share. I believe that sharing a lot of detail or bringing back those memories is hurtful, and I don't believe they are ready to share that yet. Although I would like them to share, because there are lots of generations that have already left us. My grandfather has left us, my grandmother has left us, and they're the ones that probably knew a lot more because they were probably in the midst of everything along with my parents. So I hope that someday soon I am going to have my parents share their story with me so that I can actually record it and tell my kids what my parents had to go through for me to get here, for me to actually be in a country where education is free and where you're not being punished for going to school. Well, I don't remember much about the bus trip from the Thailand camps to Bangkok, but I do remember a little bit when we were in Bangkok, because they put us up in a hotel. And so I remember, because I never been to a hotel before. I mean, this is all new territory for me, and I have never experienced on a bed that is very cushioned, or bathrooms that flushed, or showers that had running water from a faucet. So it was all new territory, and I just never experienced that before. So I went exploring one day, and I actually got lost in the hotel. And I just remember very vividly going into somebody else's room and knowing that that was not the room that we were in, because I don't think the hotels had keys back then, or in Bangkok, I'm not sure. But I remember walking into somebody else's room and realized this was not the room that we were assigned. And I just remember vividly running out of there as fast as I can. And that's pretty much the only memory that I had in the hotel room in Bangkok. And the other memory that I have is when we were actually lining up to take the bus from Bangkok to the airport. There was this gentleman who was in front of us, and he was carrying sort of like apparatus to smoke cigarettes, but actually it's an apparatus to smoke opium. And so he was in front of us, and his wife was telling him that there are people that are being forced back because they are carrying illegal instruments or illegal, I don't know, stuff with them. Maybe I'll say that again. Just carrying illegal items, carrying illegal items with them. And she told that to her husband, and her husband's like, really? I did not know that. So what he did was he chucked his apparatus for smoking the opium. And in the Hmong culture, we call that lu yang tong. Yang tong. So it's pretty much yang is the word opium. Tong is like a bottle or a instrument. And so he just chucked it. He just threw it out. And I remember hearing a splash. So he probably threw it out, and it fell into a well, or it fell into a tub of water, or it just was just thrown out. And he just like, I'm not taking that thing with me, because he wanted to go to the United States. So I remember that because I was like, what's going on? And I remember her telling him that because I was interested in why she was trying to tell him that. So that's probably the only memory that I have going from Bangkok to the airport and from the camp to Bangkok. Yes, we boarded the plane, which it was really interesting because, of course, we were primitive Hmong refugees that lived in the mountains of Laos, and so we were not dressed in the casual dress with jeans and t-shirts. We were pretty much in our garments that we had worn for a couple days. And so we got on the plane. It was a big plane because I was small back then, and I sat down and the stewardess started serving peanuts. It's like, oh, what is this? So I was like hesitant to taste the peanuts because I never had peanuts before. I opened the peanut bag and put one in my mouth and remember, oh, this is delicious. I've never had anything like this. And I remember eating a whole bag of peanuts while we're there. And that's pretty much what I remember being in the airplane coming to the United States. And then when we got to the United States, we actually had to fly into San Francisco, get checked in there, and then from San Francisco, we flew to Spokane, Washington, because our sponsors were a Lutheran Church from Post Falls, Idaho, which was totally a whole different, I guess, culture shock for myself and my parents. Probably more like for my parents because they probably remember it more than I do because they're being uprooted from what they know and what they're comfortable for a long time to something so different and something so drastically unique in terms of culture, in terms of belief, in terms of system. So the only thing I remember was we got to the Spokane International Airport and it was cold because we arrived in October. I believe it was October 8, 1980. And it was cold. It was in the fall, and they gave us this huge jacket that had these puffy fur-like hoods. And I was like, wow, this is unique. This is interesting. So I put one on, but I didn't realize that I needed it for the cold. But it was just interesting because we had a swarm of Hmong clans from Spokane who came to greet us at the airport because we were going to be the only Hmong family in Post Falls, Idaho, because our sponsors were not quite sure what to expect. So they had recruited a bunch of Hmong families from Spokane, Washington to meet us there. And also they needed to translate for my parents because, of course, we didn't speak the English language at all. And for my parents, it was very important to have familiar faces and familiar people to conversate with so that they didn't feel like they were strangers or felt like they were being accepted at that time. And then we got into my sponsor's van and they drove us to our house that was right next to the church because they were allowing us to stay in the house that the church had built because, of course, at that time, my parents had no job, no income. We had nothing. We just carried whatever we could carry in our bags or in whatever suitcase that we had. And so when we got there, it was just like starting all over again. And I remember the sponsors buying us a rice cooker because, of course, rice is the main staple of our culture, and the rice is the main meal that we have every day. So they bought this rice cooker, and they had to show us how to use it because it was an electric rice cooker. Because normally when you cook rice and you steam it, you put it in a bamboo basket and you put it over boiling water and you steam it. So they bought us this rice cooker, and it was just very interesting because we never seen this rice cooker before. You know, I still have the top of the rice cooker, but I don't have the bottom of the rice cooker. It's a really old rice cooker, so I just kept it. It was broken, but I told my mom I wanted to keep the top of it, so I still have the part that goes inside the rice cooker but the other part I don't have. Being in Idaho was a very difficult for my parents. Weather-wise, it was cold. We as kids never experienced snow before, so when we first saw snow, we went crazy. We just went out there and played in the snow and didn't realize how cold it was until we started shaking, and then we came back in the house. But I think being in Idaho was good and a bad. My parents, good for us because we came very young and we were able to acculturate ourselves into the culture. Bad for my parents because they began to feel homesick. Bad for them because they were the only Hmong family in Post Falls, Idaho. And it was also bad for them because they had no one to socialize with other than English speakers or Caucasian speakers, and there was nobody of other ethnicity in that little town. So it became an issue because my dad and my mom felt very depressed. They felt as if they were just in a strange land with no one to talk to, no one to share the culture with. And so it became an issue for my parents in terms of being depressed, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad was able to find a job at the greenhouse cutting roses. And I remember going to his greenhouse. It wasn't too far. My dad didn't have a license, so he would ride his bike every day to the greenhouse. And I don't remember how far the greenhouse was, but he would ride his bike. I think he rode his bike over 2 years to this greenhouse to cut roses. And we visited his greenhouse a couple times. We picked the flowers that they didn't cut off, and we kind of made our own bouquet. But I just remember how much my dad felt in terms of lost. Although he had a job, he just felt lost because he had no friends. He had no true friends. And he just tried his best and worked at the greenhouse for a while. And then he was able to meet a good friend of his, Steve Smoot. I remember his name, Smoot, Smoot. It was a weird name because I've never heard of the name Smoot before. And I was just like, wow, that's interesting. So I was able to meet Steve Smoot, who became his friend. And Steve and his parents kind of adopted us as their grandkids. His mom, Opal, and his dad, Elmer, they adopted us kind of like their grandkids. So they began to come to our house and they began to pick us up, and they brought us to their house, and Opal started showing me how to cook cookies or how to bake cookies, how to bake apple pie. I remember her baking rhubarb pie. It was weird because she went outside and took this red stem, green leaf thing and just pulled it out of her yard and started cutting it. And I was like, what is that? And later on she explained that it was rhubarb pie. Well, I didn't like the taste of rhubarb pie. So that was the last I had of rhubarb pie. But Opal and Elmer adopted us as grandkids, and we got to know them, and they started taking us to places. And so for us, for me, my brothers, we felt like we were at home. But still, for my parents, it was still a world away from what they knew and a world away from who they knew. So, my parents just couldn't acculturate or assimilate themselves as quickly as we did as children. I think that Post Falls is a small town, so nobody in Post Falls really knew who or where we were from. I believe they knew that we were an Asian family because of our black hair. But for them to really understand where we actually came from and what we had to do to get there, I don't think anybody knew that. Maybe our sponsors did. Maybe the pastor, Carlos, he probably knew, and his wife, probably knew where we were from and probably had an idea of what we went through. But I don't think the people that we kind of hung around with knew what we went through to get there or where we were from. I remember going to school, and I remember I did not know the language, and I didn't speak the language, so they put me in an ESL class. And fortunately, it was one of our sponsors who taught that ESL class. And I remember going to her class every day, and we just played matching games. We played naming the pictures on the cards for a while. I remember seeing that there was another Asian boy, but he was Korean. I remember him being Korean, and I think that he was adopted. Because I remember her saying something about his adopted family, but he was adopted, so he was new to the U.S., but an adopted Korean boy, so he was with Caucasian families. But my brother and myself, we were not adopted, of course, and so we pretty much just went to her class and played games when we went to elementary school all day. And then my parents, they were asked to take ESL classes through the university in Coeur d'Alene. So at that time, I believe I was 5, because we came to the U.S. when I was 5 years old. And so I was 5 years old, and my brother, he is 2 years younger than I am, so he's 3. So we had to go with my parents to their ESL class, but they dropped us off at a daycare at the college. And so we got there, and everything there was just strange, because we had, living in Laos and the refugee camps, we didn't have any toys. We didn't have a sandbox. We didn't have the toy cars, the Tonka trucks. We didn't have those things. So when we arrived at the preschool daycare center for the university, we actually just stood there and stared at all the toys. And we're like, what's this? What do we do with this? And so my brother and I slowly started playing with the toys. And we played with the toys, but we didn't speak to anybody. We were going through our silent period of trying to learn the language and trying to figure out what to say and what not to say in our own minds. And so we went through a year of just playing with the toys and not talking to anybody. Our preschool teachers thought that maybe we couldn't speak, thought that maybe there were other things going on with us. But my parents, they didn't, they said at home they speak clearly, they speak fine. But I guess because we didn't speak the language, we were not comfortable enough to speak the English language. So we went through a year of just silence in the classroom and didn't speak the language at all. And then we graduated or promoted to kindergarten. And on that day, everybody was getting up and getting their certificate. And my brother and I looked at each other and it's like, what is going on here? And we like, okay. And so our names were called. And so my brother went up there and grabbed his, and I remember this, and I was like, okay, I'm next. I'm going to be going up there, and I don't want to go up there by myself. And so I just ran up there real quickly and grabbed it and sat down with my little promotion certificate. But I remember that day, it was just all new experiences. It was a new experience for me and my brother. We just, thought it was just interesting that they gave you a piece of paper for going to school. And I didn't have that experience in the camps because I didn't go to school because of that incident that I had with a teacher, who hit the tips of my fingers with the ruler because I was late to class. And so we lived there for 5 years. We made friends who came over. I don't think our friends knew our history, our background. We played with them. They played with us. To them, we seemed like normal kids who belong there. But my parents, taking back to my parents felt they didn't belong there. So we stayed there. We lived there for 5 years. We lived in Post Falls for 5 years, and my dad injured himself in the greenhouse because they were asking him to carry huge cement buckets, because part of that was to weigh down the plastic tarp around the roses to protect them from the winter or the frost in the winter. So he injured himself, and from Spokane, sorry, let me say that again. So he injured himself, and from Post Falls, Idaho, we moved to Spokane, Washington, where there is a larger Hmong population, or a Hmong community. And we lived there for a year. So from Post Falls, Idaho, no Hmong parents, from Post Falls, Idaho, no Hmong families, to Spokane, Washington, where there was a bunch of Hmong families. So we moved to Spokane, Washington, and stayed there for a year before my dad really felt the need to be with his brothers, with his clan members, and most of them, actually all of them, lived in California. And at that time, my uncle lived in Oakland, California. And so we lived in Spokane, Washington for a year. And then my dad really was at the point where he needed to be with his clan members, his family. And so we contacted my uncle in Oakland, California, and he said, okay, he'll come and get us. So before my uncle came to pick us up, they moved from Oakland, California to Marysville, California. And then right before we wanted to come, they had the huge flood in Marysville. I think that was in 1986. That huge flood that flooded everything in Marysville. And so my uncle couldn't come, so we had to wait another year. And finally my uncle came, and he was in a train station, or he came to a wrong train station. So he got off at the wrong train station. I remember because we were anticipating him to arrive at a certain time, and we waited and waited, and at that time there was no cell phone. We had no cell phone. We only had a landline. So we waited and waited, and we get this call from my uncle, said, I'm at this train station. And I remember my dad saying, you're at the wrong train station. And he goes, okay, what do I do now? And so my dad had to get into his van, his Volvo van, and drive to go pick up my uncle. And by the time I don't know where they picked up my uncle, because he was, I didn't ask, but by the time they picked him up and brought him back to us, it was like early in the morning. So he must have gotten off at some other stop other than the one in Spokane, so probably a couple hours away. So he came. My dad had a Volvo van and a white, I want to say, Ford wagon. So we packed all our things, or whatever we could pack, in his Volvo van and his white station wagon. And my uncle drove the station wagon, and my dad drove the Volvo van, and we headed towards California. And we got to California, and I remember getting to the border of California, because this was in the summer. My uncle came in June, and when we got to California, I remember feeling so hot, because it was just so hot. It's like I never felt this hot before. And I remember I was like, I need ice, I need ice, I need ice. I remember telling my mom and dad, I need ice because I'm going to die. It's just so hot. So we got to California, and it's just, that's the one thing that kind of struck me, or that I remember the most, the weather. It was just so hot that I just didn't want to be there. But I got used to it. I'm still here. We ended up living in Marysville for, I would say, 2 years. 2 years before my dad decided to move with his clan members to Willows, California. And Willows reminded me a lot like Post Falls, Idaho. Because Willows, again, It was just a town where there's not a lot of diversity. We were probably the first wave of Hmong families that moved into Willows. And so all these teachers that had me had no idea where I was from. And I remember doing this little history project or this little history paper for this history teacher, social studies teacher, and he asked us to write a little paragraph about where we were from. And I'm like, I really don't know where I'm from, but I think since I'm Hmong, I must be from Mongolia, because my parents they've told a story about a young princess who lived in Mongolia. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll make that connection. Maybe I am from Mongolia. So from that point on, I thought, okay, I'm from Mongolia, until I got to college where I really realized that my ancestors were from Mongolia, but I'm actually from Laos, not Mongolia. So that's when in college I realized that that's where I was from. But when I was going to elementary school, I had no idea where I was from. And I felt like, I'm not quite sure if this was the correct answer to give on my paper or write for my social studies teacher at the elementary level, but I just went ahead and wrote it, and he accepted it. But it was just like, how weird, because here I am being asked where I'm from, and I have no idea, I have no clue where I was from until I got to college. And then I realized where I was really from. I believe that was not an uncommon experience because as a child, my parents never shared where we were from. We knew we were different because, of course, of our hair color and our skin color and the language that we spoke. We knew we were different. But for my parents to really give us a history of where we're from and how we got there, I don't think I learned that until I got to college. And I believe my peers at that time did not know either where we were really from and how we got here until they got to college. So I started studying my own history when I got to college, and that's where I really found out how we arrived in the United States, or how we had to leave Laos and come to the United States. But my peers at that time, being in middle school and elementary school, we had no idea. I think we felt like we were part of the American society or the American culture because we assimilated into it very quickly, and we accepted it really quickly because we had no choice. My parents, on the other hand, probably knew exactly what was going on. The acculturation was just taking over their kids, but they couldn't stop it. And I think they just wanted to promote education, because for them, they didn't have the opportunity to go to school, to do better things, or to have what they would accept to have a successful life. So for them, they just allowed us to acculturate ourselves into the American culture, and didn't share much information because they didn't want, I don't know if they wanted us to have that burden or to feel that it was a burden for them, but I think my parents wanted to shield us from the fact that they had to go through a lot to get us there. And I'm beginning to appreciate them a lot more now, since I know a lot about my history. I believe that without my dad's sacrifice and without his willingness to leave what he was so familiar with and what he was so accustomed to, took lots of courage. Not only that, but they had to shelter us from being killed or getting killed as they were fleeing the mountains of Laos into the refugee camps. And so, because I know that now about my dad and my mom, I'm beginning to appreciate my life and my children's life a lot more. And I don't want to take anything for granted. Because being in America or being in the United States, you can do anything you want to do. You have the opportunity to succeed. You have the opportunity to achieve whatever you set your mind to. But for my parents, they didn't have that choice. Their only choice was to survive. They had to survive so that we could have a better future. So their survival was crucial to me being here, and it was crucial for me so that I can have a future, so that my kids can have a future. I don't believe as a teenager and as a high schooler, you don't appreciate or you don't understand the amount of sacrifice or the grief or the depression that your parents go through until you realize and understand your own history. And this is the point where I'm at. I understand my history. I realize what it took for my parents to get here. And I want my kids to understand that, and my kids to know what their great parents or their grandparents had to go through. Unfortunately for my kids, they only have one great grandma left. So they will be able to see her and appreciate her and know her story before she passes. And hopefully they will be able to know their grandparents' story before they pass as well. Because when you realize that life is too short and you have to appreciate what you have now and know what you have now before it's too late, it might be too late because they will have already passed, and I might not have had the opportunity to ask them about my history. Other than the people that my parents met while working or going to church, I don't know if I can recall anybody else other than those three people who took their time to get to know us or to take that chance to cross the barrier, the cultural barrier, you want to call it, the unknown barrier, you want to call it, to get to know us. I don't really remember anybody else other than those three individuals that we got to know really well. You know, Steve, Opal, and Elmer. Those were the three people that I believe had a tremendous effect on my dad, because they opened their home to my dad. They didn't question who he was. They accepted him for who he was, and along with that accepted us and even adopted us as their grandkids for a while before we moved. So other than those three individuals, I can't seem to recall anybody who I strongly feel crossed those lines to help us, or to cross those lines to make us feel like we were part of the culture or part of their family. Going through school, I knew I was different. I faced a lot of prejudiced remarks. And when you face those issues, you tend to want to gravitate towards a group of people that are similar to you in terms of race. So when I went through school, I was lucky enough to be at schools, except for Willows for a while, to be at schools in Marysville that had a Hmong population. In Idaho, I didn't feel as if I was any different than the other Caucasian kids because I didn't see any other Hmong students or Hmong kids. So I didn't feel very different. I felt like I was part of the American society or part of the group. But I realized the difference when I got to California, when I went to the schools, especially in Marysville. I went to, I remember Cedar Lane Elementary School in Marysville. And I realized I was different because in the classroom, I had a lot of Hmong peers. And it's like, I never had this before. And they started speaking Hmong to me, and I realized, oh, I am different. And that's when I had my first experience of the ELD test. They call it CELDT test. I guess back then and now too. That's when I had experience of the CELDT test. Like, why do I need to take a CELDT test? Well, obviously because I spoke another language. So I took the CELDT test, and apparently because I lived in Idaho, Post Falls, Idaho, I spoke English most of the time. And so when I took the CELDT test, I was proficient. I was flapped, I wasn't limited English proficient. I was flapped, fluent English, And so I didn't really understand that terminology until now, being a teacher. I realized, what that was, And so I think when I started school in Marysville, that's when I realized that I was different because I took a CELDT test because my primary language was not English, but I passed the CELDT test. I was classified as fluent in English, and then my parents were called and they were told that, oh, she's fluent in English, and so we don't need to really put her in any ESL classes. But I didn't understand what that was until, again, now as a teacher, I understand that now, exactly what that was. But going back to my years of going through school, I seriously don't remember anybody else other than those 3 individuals who stood out as people who crossed the line or took the opportunity to get to know us a lot more. As a faculty member at a school district, I feel different, and in the sense that I have a story, or I know my own history, but nobody knows about it, and I believe that the teachers that I work with may assume that I was born in the United States or that I'm just one of them. In terms of them is one of the teachers that has ordinarily grew up in the United States, has an ordinary life, and didn't experience the tragedy that I experienced trying to come to the United States after the war. As a faculty member, I don't think, or I know that our stories are not being heard, and that our peers or our colleagues, they need to know that we may be colleagues, but there is something that is different about me, and I think that everybody has a story that is, or that tells a part of their life that nobody else knows about, a history that could be important so that we can relate to our own students, a history that we can share so that people know us, in terms of us, know the Hmong culture better. I just don't think that as a faculty member, sometimes I don't think that I'm willing to share that history too, because it's so, it's an intimate part of who I am that it takes courage for me to share that history. And in order for me to share that history, I have to really know you, and you have to really know me. Because in a way, I feel like perhaps I want to share something with you, but you may not be willing and open to listen to what I have to say. So, it is an intimate part, the history is an intimate part of who I am. And being part of a faculty, some faculty members you may be close friends with, and some you may not. And I think that there are a lot of teachers out there that sometimes we don't have the opportunity to get to know them. And so it's hard when they ask you about your history. You just want to share, I went to school here and I graduated from here. And I don't know if that's the history they want to hear, but that's the history I'm willing to share. And so when a part of history in me, I'm sorry, let me say that again. When an intimate part of history, when I have an intimate part of history that I'm not willing to share, I won't share. And I'll be willing to share when I get to know you more. So I think that in time, there will be more teachers willing to share who have experienced what I've experienced. But I think for me, it just takes time to get to know that person before I really share my history. Well, I think as a teacher, you don't know who's sitting in front of you, or you don't know where your students come from until you take the time to ask them where they're from, and until you take the time to share your own history with them. As teachers, we are teaching a classroom full of diverse students, and as a teacher, I think sometimes taking the time out and just researching or talking to other people about your students' history would be great too as well. I mean, just getting to know just what that culture is like. Not necessarily your student, but just the culture itself that your student is from. Getting to know who are the Hmong people, or getting to know who are the, migrant workers, or who are the, Punjabi students, or what culture, what do you do in your culture, when you celebrate weddings. Just to get to know the culture itself, not just the student. When you have that information about that culture, I think it opens doors for you and opens students' willingness to share, because once you begin to use or begin to know the students' background in terms of culture, the students tend to open up to you a lot more. Just like me, if I don't know you and I know that you don't know about my culture, I don't think I'm going to share any intimate details about my history with you. And I think that relates back to the classroom too. You have to know the students' culture. You have to know a little bit about their history before they open up and share things with you, or before they even want to learn in your classroom. They have to feel as if you know something about them, as if you're willing to go out there and make the effort to get to know who they are, not just themselves, not just the students, but the students' culture. You don't have to necessarily know the student, but just the culture that the student's from. Just little information, and share with them what you know. And you might be surprised. They might be willing to share a lot more, because now they feel as if you are an intimate person in their life versus just a stranger that they're going to take a class from and move on to the next class. The Outsiders, when I taught The Outsiders, I think I read The Outsider when I was a middle school student too, and I think at that time I couldn't relate to it as much as I do now as an adult, because back then we were reading it for understanding the story elements, and at that time I did not know I didn't know too much about the definitions of story elements, or couldn't relate it too much to the theme, because I couldn't figure out what the theme was at that time, because I didn't know what theme was. So I think as a teacher, reading that story again, The Outsider, I relate to it better now, because I grew up feeling as if I was an outsider. And going through college, I also felt like I was an outsider. You know, again, I didn't feel like I was an outsider until I came to California, because we didn't, in Idaho, there wasn't a lot of Hmong students, or there were none. We were the only Hmong people or Hmong family there. So when I got to California, I realized that I was different. And California, unfortunately, is where I experienced the racism, the prejudice, because there was maybe so many of us, or because there was not a lot of knowledge out there about how these people came. And so that's when I realized I was different, that I was the outsider, that I needed to teach why I was an outsider. I needed to educate my peers, or educate my colleagues why I'm an outsider. And so I think that in hindsight, if I knew then what I know now as a student, I would have been more willing to share my history. But at that time, as a student, I wasn't comfortable, because I felt like an outsider. Having gone through the education system and now being an educator myself, I realized that as a young teenage girl, you're very vulnerable, or you're very susceptible to other people's comments that are degrading, and it hurts. And so I wanted to shield myself from that. And I think now I would have done something different. I would have told my teachers when I went to school. Would have told my teachers who I was, or where I was really from, instead of Mongolia. And so, as a teacher, the Outsider book really brought it to home, because I realized that throughout my entire educational life, I walked a pathway that excluded me, or that I excluded myself as an outsider. And I never felt, or never learned to be part of the American society, or the group that I would be in, because again, I would gravitate towards people who were similar in terms of culture, and similar in terms of language, versus gravitating towards just, students who I would get to know. At the beginning of this school year, we actually did a little paragraph where the students wrote, who they are. So it pretty much starts with, I am, and they say I am the daughter, or the son, or whatever they want. So in that little blurb, I kind of shared a little bit of myself to the students, because I think I'm at the point where I'm willing to share, and I'm at the point where I believe strongly that students need to know me, and know my background, because then maybe they can relate to whatever experience I've had, and then that will open the door for them to share, or be willing to want to learn in my classroom, because I've had that experience. But I don't think at middle school, being a middle school teacher, I just didn't have the courage to share with the kids, because I was not sure how they would take that information. And I don't know if they had the background knowledge or the knowledge to understand or to comprehend the complexity that that encompasses. Everybody has a story, and sometimes students don't want to share the stories in the classroom, but they're willing to share the story when they're alone with you. And I think that it is so important for teachers to have an open door policy, where you leave the classroom open and students can come in and talk to you anytime they want to, because that's when you get to know your students more. I think that if my teachers had stated that you can bring your lunch and eat it with me, I think that would have opened more doors for them to get to know me and for me to get to know them, versus everybody go at lunch, my door is locked, you don't come in and interrupt me. So I think that one question that I would like to ask myself is, why did I become an educator? I mean, what along the path made me choose the career that I have chosen? And I'm sure my parents would have loved for me to become a doctor, or loved for me to become an engineer, or some other field that it makes a lot more money than teachers do. But I believe that along my years of growing up in going through the education system, I know how students who are like me feel. When I say like me, I know that there are students who sit in the classroom who don't speak. Students who sit in the classroom who are very shy, because I went through school as a shy girl who didn't speak in class, who didn't raise her hand. So I know that from that perspective, I think in my heart, I knew that I wanted to become a teacher because I wanted someone to help me. I wanted someone to help me so that I could find my voice. And I think that I now want to help my students so that they can find their voice and share their story, whatever that may be, or find a voice in the classroom just to have the courage to speak up about a question or to share an answer to a question. Because I went through my whole education system not raising my hand, being in the classroom. So I know that there are students out there who were like me or who are like me when I went through school, and I want to be able to provide them with that voice. They may be shy, but they know the answers and they are wanting to share. But how do you go about getting them to share? Is you have them share regardless what, and you make that classroom a classroom where it's a safe environment to share. You make that classroom where nobody's teasing each other. You make it a classroom where the students feel that they belong. Because I think part of me wanting to be a teacher is having experienced that the education system and not feeling like I belonged, and feeling like I was an outsider all the time because I didn't raise my hand in the classroom. I wasn't called on. I just didn't interact at all with the teachers or the other students who were not of my ethnicity or who were not Hmong. So for me, that desire became very clear when I got to college. That I was like, okay, that's what I want to do. I want to be a teacher so that I can give my students a voice, because I was that student who went through school that didn't have a voice.